There was one thing that I neglected to tell you. When I went over the fall, when Adam and Eve sinned and the fall occurred, and the curse of death came on all creation, as a South Floridian, I used to always question what was God's point of making ticks, fleas, and mosquitoes, right? I mean, just, what do you got in mind, God, you know? And so I want to put that into this picture for you. Before Adam and Eve sinned, apparently those things weren't that way. A matter of fact, what we see is that mosquitoes can actually live on nectar. It's the ones that are breeding, the females that are trying to breed, that actually seek after blood. But I'm told in Alaska still, when there's not enough blood around, they can actually live on nectar, which I was very surprised. And also thorns are a product of the fall, and then we actually read that part where God's going to make thorns and thistles as part of the fall. And I know there was a botanist that told me that they had mapped the genome, the DNA of a leaf, of a thorn, and it's an actual mutated leaf gene. And so that was supportive evidence. So the idea is this, and I'm just giving you our best hypothesis from the information that we have. God created a perfect world. We know that because the scripture tells us so. But he tells us that there were changes made at the time of the fall, that he went in and put in thorns and thistles, that women would have more pain in childbirth. There were changes that occurred at that point. What we believe is that God actually did some genetic re-engineering at that time. He didn't come in and recreate. He took the existing information and changed it so that it would function under the cursed world that we now have. And the reason this is important is when you look at things like parasites that have a parasitic lifestyle, and you look at that as a Christian, you go, what's up with that? Well, that is reflecting a change that was made after the curse of death came on all creation, and that those changes apparently were made so that things could function in the cursed world that we live in, but someday they'll be put back to their original perfect condition. And so we were talking about, and actually if you're into this stuff, Creation Magazine and Answers Magazine keep giving articles that support these kind of things if you want information. And they have had information before about a lioness, a full-grown female lion that would not eat meat. She was raised on a vegetarian diet, and no matter what they tried, they couldn't get her to eat meat. And she was totally healthy, had baby lions, no problem, etc. So that's just the kind of flashes that we get sometime of what the pre-flood world might have looked like, what things might have been like beforehand. So I just want to throw that out because I forgot, and I'm sorry. So anyway, and if you do have questions, please, if you're not going to ask them, bump somebody next to you that will ask for you, because I really want you to ask your questions. Because if I know what I'm trying to say, but that doesn't mean it's coming out here. And so if I confuse you at all, please stop me and ask me so that I can clarify what I'm trying to get across. Yes, ma'am.
You were saying about the nectar with mosquitoes, is that why a lot of times amber, because of sugar or anything, like is that why they're fossilized?
Actually, amber is just tree sap that has gone over something and then because of the heat and pressure become fossilized. So it's just something that got caught in tree sap. Okay? Alrighty. So far, we've already done some information on the Earth being 6,000 years old, but that's going to be peppered throughout. We talked about the curse of death that came in because of Adam's sin. We talked about the flood and the rocks and the fossils that were laid down by the flood. So let's briefly do the Ice Age. We also talked about that the rocks and the fossils are the best evidence for evolution and an old Earth, or they're the best evidence for a global flood and a young Earth. And so we have to pick what we're going to do with it. Only 8 people got on the ark and escaped God's first judgment. And so those 8 people were the ones that got off the ark, and actually 6 of them were from where all of us come from. Noah and his wife had 3 boys, and so those 3 boys and their daughter-in-laws is where everybody that's on planet Earth comes from today. And then we already talked about the strata and the fossils. That's an octopus fossil. I just had to show you that because, I mean, that's amazing that these soft tissue animals will fossilize like this. Anyway, let's look at the Ice Age. The secular scientists will tell you that there were multiple Ice Ages. The reason they tell you that is because of how they misread the rock strata and the fossils. If we read the rocks and the fossils, read as in interpreting what we're seeing there as the flood, then we see that there was an ice age and it was actually caused by the flood. Now, I want you to be very clear. The evolutionary scientists believe there were multiple ice ages, but they can't tell you why there is ever even one. Because an ice age requires warm winters and cool summers. You see, if it's too cold all the time, it won't snow, and therefore it won't set up the glaciers, which are how an ice age is defined. The ice age was, so after the flood, the ark landed, there were probably very few trees, it was probably muddy and yucky. An ice age, and all of us believe this, evolutionary scientists and creation scientists, an ice age it was not when the whole planet was covered by ice. None of us believe that. The ice age was a time when there were more glaciers than what we see today. About 30% of the planet was covered in glaciers during the ice age compared to what it is today. And from what we see, the ice age, excuse me, the glaciers were in different places than where we see today. Today, the predominance of the glaciers would be found at, oh, and just so we clarify, glaciers are basically rivers of ice, because they move still. So I just want to be clear, that's basically what we're talking about. And for these glaciers to have existed during the ice age, they existed in different places than today. Today, the vast majority are at the North and the South Pole. During the ice age, the glaciers were inland in the upper latitudes. So the farther you got away from the equator, and if you were on the land, that's where you saw the glaciers. But if you and I went to the North Pole, we could have gone on a fishing trip. There'd be no ice there, and there's no land there. Or if you went to Antarctica, we could have had a beach picnic along the coast during the ice age. But if you went inland in Antarctica, then eventually after the flood, you'd have hit the glaciers. So it was a very different situation. If you were near the water, it was warm during the ice age. And if you were inland in the upper latitudes, there were glaciers and it was cold.
And why they're freshwater glaciers?
Glaciers are always freshwater because they're formed from snow. That's a really good question, Missy. And so literally where glaciers come from is as the water evaporates out of the ocean and then it precipitates out, it's always fresh water. It's the distillation process. When water evaporates out of the ocean, it literally leaves the salt behind. So the oceans are becoming more salty all the time. And then that would come up, and when it's over an area near the equator, it would rain and rain and rain and rain and rain. If you were farther from the equator, it would snow and snow and snow. And so that's why I said you needed to have colder summers and warmer winters, because for this to continue to snow, if it's too cold, it won't snow. So you want it warm enough that it'll snow. And then you want it cool enough in the summer that the glaciers don't completely melt. So these are very specific conditions that you need to have an ice age. And it's hard for them to explain those conditions. Now, yes, Beth?
Well, mine's on something different, so I'll wait until.
Okay. So what causes an ice age? Warm oceans and cold air. And why would we have warm oceans and cold air? And I just want to throw this out now. Have any of you ever seen the movie years ago? They had a movie called The Day After Tomorrow. And it was an ice age scenario. And the way they started all those superstorms that caused that ice age scenario was they had a warm water current in a cold environment in the North Atlantic. Do you guys remember that? Well, I loved it when I saw that movie because I'd been teaching for years, because the creation scientists teach the reason we have the one ice age is we had warm oceans left over from the flood, because remember, the oceans were in direct contact with the mantle of the earth, spewing hot water into the earth's oceans and into the atmosphere. Today, the average temperature of the Earth's oceans is 4 degrees Celsius, which is right about 37 degrees Fahrenheit, just basically what it would come out of your refrigerator, about the same temperature as the Earth's oceans. Even if you go to the equator, go 100 feet down, 4 degrees Celsius. It's just cold. And you've felt that before when you get in the water, you feel the warmer water on the top, the cooler water underneath. Okay, so average temperature then would have been about 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Yeah, big change from 37 degrees to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, the average temperature of the Earth's oceans, because of that influx of all that hot water. And what would cause the cold air was the immense amount of volcanic activity. When you have a volcano erupt, it throws ash and aerosols into the air, and that causes a lot of the sun's warmth to be bounced back into outer space rather than being absorbed by the greenhouse effect. and therefore it can make the Earth's atmosphere very cold. In 1815, there was a volcano that erupted in Tambora. 1816 was known as a year without a summer worldwide from one volcano erupting the year before. So when you have all of the continents being shifted apart, you have a lot of volcanic activity available to throw the ash and aerosols into the air. So our Bible literally gives us why there was ever an ice age. The flood explains it because we had warm water. And do you know what's interesting is many ancient cultures remember the flood as a warm water flood. I found that very interesting. So we had warm water and cold air caused by the flood, and that would have set up the vast amounts of evaporation and it condensing into clouds and then precipitating. And that means during the ice age, which would have started after the flood and lasted around 700 to 1,000 years. And where that estimate comes from is how long it would take for the Earth's oceans to cool. You see, as long as the oceans have a particular temperature, they affect global weather patterns, don't they? You guys know that. If there's an El Nino or La Nina, it affects weather literally throughout the planet. And so when you change the Earth's ocean temperatures, it changes the weather patterns globally. And so it would take between 700 and 1,000 years for the Earth's oceans to finally cool, and that's what would have caused the ice age to end. The volcanoes apparently settled pretty quickly. It was the heat that was still in the oceans that caused the ice age to last the distance in time that it did. Now, I just wanted to show you some of the volcanoes to give you an idea of the scale of these volcanoes. We were actually talking a little bit about that on the way up here because we still have a huge crater under Yellowstone National Park. You've probably heard that before, and it was one of these super volcanoes. And this is by Dr. Steve Austin, who is a geologist and a volcanologist. He studies all these things. And this just shows to give you a little scale for the size of the reach of some of the volcanoes. Now, I want you to be very clear. I am not showing you the size of the crater or caldera of the volcano. I'm showing you the reach as far as the ash and the lava and that kind of reach, okay? And so some of these volcanoes that existed in the past, if you can see this red one, that's how the volume of the amount of lava and ash that it put out, and literally it would take up the western United States. And then you see this little one down here that's purple? Well, it still would have taken up several states in the western United States. Notice this one takes up and affects a large portion. What I'm saying to you is these were large volcanoes that had a large reach. And it's interesting to me, there's a dot down here that is Mount St. Helens. And Mount St. Helens erupted with the same strength as a Hiroshima-sized bomb every second for 9 hours. And yet it's a wimpy little tiny volcano compared to these ones that we're talking about. So
What was its strength?
one Hiroshima-sized bomb, atomic bomb, power-wise, every second for 9 hours. Mount St. Helens, they knew it was going to erupt. The whole side of the mountain had come out by like 5 feet. You know, when the mountain starts moving like that, it's time to leave. So, what we have, I told you, the ice age was caused by warm water and cold air. I told you that we could go fishing in the Arctic Ocean, or we could have a beach picnic around the coast of the Antarctica. But if you went inland during the ice age, and the upper latitudes, it was cold and it was glaciated. It was starting to form glaciers in places. And so, I'm just going to show you, what continent do you think of when you see these animals?
Africa.
Thank you. These were animals that lived in Great Britain during the Ice Age. Now, why? And we had elephants here during the Ice Age. If you go to Arcadia and you do fossil hunting in the Peace River, you will find pieces of Columbian mammoths. They were here during the Ice Age, after the flood. So the point is, if you were near the water during the Ice Age, it was warm, and if you were inland, it was cold. So in Great Britain, they had animals that we don't think of as animals in that area, and they had spread out from the mountains of Ararat after the flood, after getting off of the Ark, and had taken up residence in some of these places because the Ice Age, well, like I said, lasted 700 to 1,000 years, and so these animals made their homes in these places because it was warm. Yes?
How did the animals get over?
We're going there.
And the people too.
We're going there.
Okay.
We're going there. That's a good question. Okay, let me do one other thing first. Today, when we have hurricanes, it leaves a layer of sediments after the hurricane because, it steals the beach from one place and deposits it in another place. And the layers are about like that. For years, I have had students telling me that are now adults and have children that there were hypercanes that hit Florida because they see these strata, that these sediment layers that are huge. So it was indicative of huge storms. Now, an evolutionist might interpret it as an ice age in and of itself. We interpret it as the evidence of a huge storm. And if the Earth's oceans were warm worldwide, think of the hurricanes you'd have gotten. I mean, serious stuff. And so they are called hypercanes. And today a hurricane is only about the size of the state of Florida. 75 to 150 mile an hour winds may last for, several days to a week. These storms, we believe, were the size of continents. They had wind speeds up to 500 miles an hour, and they lasted for weeks. In other words, when Noah and the family got off the ark, it was not a good environment still. It wasn't, oh, joy, we got off the ark and everything's fine now. No, they had just gone through judgment, and things were not good. And you notice where God put them. He didn't land them in Florida, did he? He landed them in the mountains of Ararat, so they were far from the ocean, so that they had more of a chance to not get destroyed by these things. And then the excellent question is, so how did they get from the mountains of Ararat all the other places on planet Earth? And this is just, there's water erosion that we see in the Sahara Desert. Evidence to the extent that it used to be a lush and tropical rainforest. And actually, if you go to the Holy Land over there, they'll tell you it was a lush and tropical rainforest during the last ice age. So we all have the evidence as to why. And we see the water erosion over there, and we can explain why, because it was during the Ice Age, so there was plenty of water available. As a matter of fact, the Bible mark for the end of the Ice Age may be represented by Pharaoh's dream of 7 years of feast and 7 years of famine, because Joseph, with the coat of many colors, was approximately 700 years after the flood, and that would be around the time that the Earth's oceans would have cooled. So that could be why we see the 7 years of feast and 7 years of famine, because the water was getting cut off at that point. But up until then, it was lush and tropical, and there was actually water in that region. Now, I want you to think with me for a minute. When they first get off the ark, there's no glaciers, because it's a warm water flood. It's going to take time for those glaciers to build up, which means every bit of water on planet Earth is in the ocean. Sea level was over 300 feet deeper than what it is today. Secular scientists will tell you that too. Sea level was 300 feet deeper than what it is today, which means Florida didn't exist. If you went upstate, there were a couple bumps that were called islands. You know what I'm saying? And that's it. Okay. As the Ice Age progressed, what's happening is water is being pulled out of the ocean and being precipitated in the form of snow on the land. And so sea level is coming down. Now, the best way I can describe this to you is, Floridians, we like our ice water, don't we? So if you have a full glass of ice water, and it's full, and you take some of the ice cubes out and you put it on a plate next to your glass, the water level's going to drop. And then if you take 1 or 2 ice cubes and add it back, the water level will come back up part way, but not fully, right? After the flood, all of the water was in the Earth's ocean. Sea level was 300 feet higher than what it is today. As the Ice Age progressed, the sea level changed by a full 600 feet. And once again, the evolutionary scientists will tell you the exact same thing. We all see this evidence. Sea level dropped by 600 feet, which means it was 300 feet lower than what it is today during the peak of the Ice Age, because it's like taking your glass and pulling the ice cubes out of your glass. The water level drops. And when that occurred, literally, sea level, I'm just showing you, the glaciers actually formed inland in these areas, okay? And if you came down as far as St. Louis, it looked like the North Pole. And these are from a secular textbook. We all have the exact same information. It's just how we choose to interpret it. But when sea level dropped, these are pictures from the internet showing you, so once again, these ages are not true, but showing you the size of Florida when sea level dropped. And they literally, along our Gulf Coast, they have found on the continental shelf, they have found Indian villages and different things showing them that they know that this was all exposed in the relatively recent past because of the difference in the sea level. Well, when that occurred, that means all the land bridges between all of the continents were exposed. So literally, from the mountains of Ararat, they could have walked into every continent on the planet during the Ice Age. Literally. And the animals could have walked, hopped, slithered, anything they needed to do. Now, I'm going to take a risk and just throw you out something here. Any of you ever seen the movie March of the Penguins? Okay. Some of you don't go out and see it if you don't really love penguins, okay? Because it can be kind of boring in certain places. But you liked it. See, she loved it. So if you want to see it, go see it. But what I want to say is this, because I'm a terribly cynical person, so please forgive me. God's still working on me. As I'm watching March of the Penguins, and in case you haven't seen it, these are the emperor penguins. They're amazing birds, and they, like so many other creatures, go back to where they were born to have their babies. And the problem is they were born way inland, and the ice in Antarctica starts miles out from the coast. So these poor birds are walking all the way inland to where they were hatched, and then mama and daddy penguin have their egg, and mama passes it to daddy penguin. He stands there for literally 2 months in the coldest place on earth, at the coldest time of year in the wintertime. He stands there holding this egg on his feet under his little fat layer, and he's got to stand there without eating or drinking for 60 days until mama goes and feeds and comes back. Then he'll pass the egg to her, she'll hatch the baby, and he, if he's blessed, will make it back to the water because he's got to go so far because, like I said, the glaciers, and then he's got to get all the way back out past the glaciers to the ocean. Now, I watched that, and I said, what's wrong with those stupid birds? Seriously, I'm looking at this going, this doesn't make sense. And then I started to think through what I know. After the flood, everybody fanned out from Ararat. The penguins went down to Antarctica, probably swam, but to have their eggs, they had to come on land. And they picked a rookery, and they had their babies, and they always keep going back to the same place to have their babies. But as the ice age progressed, glaciers started to build up. And eventually, those poor silly birds have to go miles and miles and miles to get back to where they were born because the glacial buildup has occurred because the ice age ended and we get the weather patterns that we do today. There's a lot of things that make sense once you understand the biblical model. And there's a lot of things you'll look at and wonder, why does that happen that way? And then if you process it, it will start to make more sense, like those silly birds. So you see how everybody could have walked, literally. I want to throw out one other thing. In the Bible, 7 is the number of completeness. In the Bible, 6 is the number of man. Notice men live on 6 of the 7 continents, but there are 7 continents because God gave us the number of completeness. So people don't live on Antarctica. We visit, but we don't live there, okay? And so people could have literally walked into all these. They could have walked into Antarctica too, but they apparently didn't. A lot of critters did, but they didn't. Yes, Beth?
What about the different races?
We're getting there.
Okay.
We're going to do that.
Sorry.
Nope, it's all good. Now, just want to throw out one more thing. It's all good. No, it's good. Throw out one more thing. A lot of people will tell you the ice layers will build up slowly. And actually at the beginning of that movie, The Day After Tomorrow, they were looking at the ice cores and they were saying how this went back millions of years, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, because they think the ice cores build up slowly too. And so some people would use that as evidence. I want to be very clear on this. Ice doesn't take long to build up either. This is the most fun evidence I can give you for that. In 1942, during the Second World War, there was a squadron that had to land in Greenland, I'm pretty sure. And it was either Greenland or Iceland. I'm pretty sure it was Greenland. One way or another, in the 1980s, some guy says, wow, they just belly landed up there. Oh, and the people were saved. I just want you to know that. They did get to help. But the point is, they belly landed these planes. So a guy 40 years later, he goes, I want to go salvage those planes. They're going to be worth a fortune. And they figure they're just going to dust the ice and snow off of them and bring them home. They go up there, and you ready? They found them 250 feet under the ice layer. It was less than 50 years. 250 feet of ice had built up over those plains in less than 50 years. So it doesn't take long periods of time. I just want to be very clear on this, including the glaciers. Even the evolutionary scientists are starting to say that this is why we see a lot of the formations we do out west. These are from secular textbooks, that's why they have these dates. But they tell us that a lot of the formations out west were from ice age buildups that when they started to melt, the flooding from the ice age buildups that were melting actually ripped out a lot of holes. And these, even the evolutionists will tell you, are valleys and places that the ice age flooding ripped out. So once again, when we look at Grand Canyon, even the evolutionists are starting to say that they think there was a huge lake that backed up behind that and it ripped that out. They will not equate themselves with us because we're the creationists. We're called the catastrophists. So evolutionists that now believe these things happen quickly and then there's millions of years in between, they're called neo-catastrophists because they don't want to be associated with us. And neo just means new, so they're the new catastrophists. We're the original catastrophists. So anyway, and what about frozen woolly mammoths and rhinos that we find up there? Well, it's interesting. This is the Arctic Ocean, and these red spots are actually where they find frozen woolly mammoths, and the yellow spots are where they find frozen rhinos. And the question is, well, my first question, because I own horses, is who fed all the elephants? Because let's think about this for a minute. There were a bunch of elephants that lived up there. We know that because if you go to Russia on the north coast of Siberia in the Arctic Ocean, they tell you they have a never-ending supply of ivory there because so many elephants went in and died there. So the question logically would be, who fed all those elephants? I mean, you got to have grass to take care of large groups of elephants, right? So why was there grass up there? They never asked those questions. See, those are the things that bug me. And this model of the Ice Age explains it. If you were near the water, it was warm. If you were inland, it was cold, which means even along the north coast of Siberia, it was warm enough that there was grass along there. And for 700 to 1,000 years, Mama Mammoth knew that if the weather got bad inland, she'd head for the beach. It was safe if she went to the beach. And so this last time when the oceans finally cooled and the weather patterns would have shifted very quickly once the oceans finally cooled and the Arctic cap would have started to form, etc. Mama Mammoth looks like she was heading for the water when she got frozen. And that would explain why there were so many up there also. I want you to notice they all seem to be heading for the water or are close to a water source when they're buried. But there's a lot of them that aren't frozen, so I want to be very clear that those were still odd conditions. A lot of animals that made it through the flood and through the Ice Age wouldn't have done well at the end of the Ice Age. When you have very fast climatic shifts, where the climate shifts very quickly, large animals don't do very well. And so dinosaurs that took up residence in the tropical rainforest in North Africa would have all of a sudden found the water supply turned off and would have died. They still find remnant crocodiles in lakes deep in the Sahara Desert that are literally remnants from the Ice Age. And they've been isolated in these pockets and they still find them in certain places there, which is really cool when you think about it. Also, I want you to know that they've actually used radar to find where the rivers used to run under the Sahara Desert. And so this is common knowledge. It's not just the creationists. I want you to know this. This just explains how it fits in. So the lower rocks are global, so there'd be flood layers. The uppermost rocks we believe are Ice Age layers from Ice Age flooding. They're not global. They're countrywide, they're regional, and they get smaller and smaller size-wise as they go up because the traumatic floods were getting less and less as the Earth was coming back to some form of equilibrium. And I was telling the girls on the way here that a person much smarter than myself, Dr. Kurt Wise, explained to me, like you take an ice cube and you drop it in a glass of water and it goes down and it comes back up and it levels out. He said that after the breaking apart of the continents during the flood, he said it would take about 25,000 years for the crust to actually stop doing this and actually level out. And he said we're seeing it only 4,300 years after it. So that's why we see the shifting that we still do, the continental shifting, the earthquakes that we do, the volcanoes that we do, a lot of the storms that we do. See, most Christians don't even know to associate these kind of natural disasters with the first judgment. They just go, why, Lord? Why do you do that? Well, actually, we're still seeing the planet groaning to come back to equilibrium after the first judgment. Yeah, when you realize that, all of a sudden things start making more sense, don't they? Yes, Missy?
So a question, like you used the glass thing where if you take the ice out, the water goes down. So as the glaciers are
melting,
is that why we're seeing land loss around Florida and California? Because now it's starting to go back up. So
well,
that we're eroding it.
Good question. As the Ice Age ended and the Earth's oceans finally cooled, so you have the warmer water near the equator, the colder water near the poles. Then the glaciers, the inland glaciers started to melt because you no longer had these cold summers. So they started to melt. As they melt, that water runs off into the ocean, doesn't it? And so it would level back out that sea level to what approximately we see today. Also, if you remove the Arctic cap from the North Pole today, scientists can't tell you why it ever formed because it's a freshwater cap. Well, at the end of the Ice Age, when those glacial melt would have run off into the Arctic Ocean, fresh water rides on top of salt water very nicely, and it freezes much easier than salt water does, and it explains the formation of the Arctic cap. There are so many scientific things that our Bible explains that evolution does not. The problem is people are unaware of it. And so as I studied all this stuff, the original name of our ministry was Censored Science. Now, don't go look that up because you'll get all sorts of porn and stuff that'll come up and it'll scare you half to death, okay? But 25 years ago, that was the name of our original ministry because we had college students say, why don't we ever hear about this? Why is it being kept from us? It's censored science. And we just thought it was catchy, you know? So, and it really is, it's kept away from us. Now, I'm gonna do this part really fast because I really want to get past this. If we wanted to look at what we thought the pre-flood world looked like from us looking at the fossils and the rock layers, we believe that it had hot water reefs at the bottom, then shallow seafloors, floating forests, coastal dunes, and inland areas. And the reason we believe that is because what we see in the rocks. So this would be a picture of what we think the pre-flood world looked like from what we see in the rocks and the fossils. Now, why do we believe that? Because when the flood started, what we see at the bottommost rock layers, which would have started at the edge, are fossils of hot water reefs. And so that's why they're at the lowest level, so that's why we believe they were out at the edge of the continental shelf on the original supercontinent. As this underwater landslide continues as the flood progresses, then we see what is known by scientists as the Cambrian Explosion, that we see in that one layer that is one of the lowest layers of the rocks. All of a sudden there's life. That's why it's called the Cambrian Explosion, because even the evolutionists will say life exploded onto the scene and they can't figure out why. I can. Anyway, and so what you have there is your continental shelf being buried. And get this, if evolution was true, this shouldn't be true. Every phyla of animal, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, every phyla of animal is found in the Cambrian Explosion. That shouldn't be if life evolved over periods of time. Even vertebrates are found in the Cambrian layer. Should not be if it evolved. But if it just got buried quickly, that's why we would see this way. Yes, ma'am?
What's their explanation for that?
They just stay away from it. No, that's one they really just stay away from. And they go, obviously life exploded on the scene. It's a good question. And then we think there were floating forests. And I'm just going to throw this out just ever so quickly. There are still quaking bogs. A floating forest is a forest that literally does not attach itself in the ground. It floats. And we think there were huge ones before the flood. And the reason we say that is we think that's where the coal deposits come from that we see worldwide. And there are huge. Quaking bogs still exist, and this is just pictures of two of them. And what happens is if you walked into this quaking bog and you're walking through the forest, if you get a group of people to all jump up and down with you at the same time, the big trees will start doing this. I know. And the reason it does that is because they're not in the ground, they're floating. And so there are still places like this. Now, would not exist today in the oceans, could it? Because there's too much wave action now. But previously, we believed that the oceans were calm, and that's why these huge log mat type forests could exist. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I read somewhere the movie Avatar.
Yeah.
You see through it, and they have like those floating forests. His idea came from quaking bogs.
Really? I was unaware of that. Thank you. Hanya.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Okay, thank you. That's great. Yes, ma'am.
What are they floating on their root systems?
Yeah, and the roots actually were never made to go in the ground. When they see these fossilized roots, they actually look almost like bottle brushes.
Like mangroves, almost kind of.
Worse. Mangroves are actually with
They're
the
rooted.
prop roots are rooted. Exactly. But these, the roots, I've seen pictures of the fossilized roots. They actually look like a bottle brush where they come out and then they have the leaf, the rootlets coming out from all different directions like a bottle brush.
So neat.
It is. It's very cool. It's very cool. But I'm getting off track. So anyway, floating forests. And we believe those were in the continental, along the edge of the continental shelf, but in the water. And the reason we see that is because that would be the next thing to get eaten up and buried during the flood. And what we see next is a lot of fossil forest stuff. And that's where we would explain why we had such huge deposits of coal. Because as this stuff fell out, then the peat and stuff would be deposited, and that would explain why we see the coal deposits we do. And I don't know if you can tell, but this is one of these kind of trucks that you have to climb a ladder to get into, because it's like a 2-story truck to give you scale for the amount of coal that we see. And I understand if the evolutionists were correct, you would have to have millions and millions of years to explain this kind of coal deposit. But if this was deposited from the floating forest, it would make sense too. And I have had people in my Sunday school classes from Kentucky that told me, well, this explains why you see flowers going through what's supposed to be millions of years of coal deposits, and there's fossil flowers going through that. There's things in the deposits that don't make sense unless they were buried very quickly. And so there are places like that. And then lastly, there were coastal dunes, and we see that because of the sand deposits that we have. And then your animals that lived inland would have been buried last. So that's just how we see what the pre-flood world might have looked like by looking at the fossil evidence. I just wanted you to know that. Now let's do radiometric dating, because this gets to a lot of people. Okay, radiometric dating, carbon-14 dating, potassium argon dating, uranium lead dating, isochron dating, just so you know what I'm talking about. This is a big intimidation to a lot of Christians, because they go, well, what about the dating methods? Okay, well, let's look at them. First off, radiometric dating is a process that estimates how old the rock is, and it does that by the radioactive elements that are found in there. And I'm going to explain this. All forms of radiometric dating are based upon assumptions about the past. So if we assume that the Earth is old, we're going to get one set of data out of the radiometric decay. And if we assume something else, we're going to get a different interpretation. It's just like what we were looking at before. But let's go through it so that you can really understand it. And what I'm going to do is carbon-14 dating, okay? Because most people have heard of carbon-14 dating. First off, carbon-14 dating is only used to date something, how long it's been dead. So you can't use it on a rock. I want to be very clear, unless that rock was something fossilized that now it's dead. Okay, so if you're working with an igneous rock, a rock that came from lava or magma or something like that, then they're going to use potassium argon dating, uranium lead dating, one of the other forms of dating, not carbon-14. Okay, carbon-14, once alive, now it's dead. The reason it works is this. Carbon exists, all carbons have subatomic particles. All carbons have 6 protons and 6 electrons, but they can have differing numbers of neutrons because the neutrons are neutral. The protons are positive, the electrons are negative. All carbons have 6 protons. That's what makes it a carbon. If you add 1 proton and make it 7 protons, now it's nitrogen. Instead of being a solid, crumbly, black thing, now you've got a colorless, odorless gas. Okay? Man, does God have a Lego set or what? But anyway, okay, so all carbons have 6 protons, but they can have differing number of neutrons. If it has 6 protons and 6 neutrons, you count those particles up, and it's called a carbon-12. If you have 6 protons and 7 neutrons, you count those up, and it's a carbon-13. If you have 6 protons and 8 neutrons, you add those up, and it's a carbon-14. So far, so good. These are isotopes of carbon. Isotopes are like siblings. There's a whole bunch of people in my family that are Frates, and then there are different individual Frates. That's what isotopes are within an element, carbon. So far, so good. Okay, this one is like my second daughter when she's had too much soda and birthday cake. Okay, because this dude is unstable. Carbon-14 is unstable. Carbon-14 wants to get rid of some of that extra energy. That's what radioactive isotopes do, is they're unstable because they have too much energy, and there's 3 different ways that we are aware of that they can get rid of that extra energy: alpha decay, beta decay, and gamma decay. But the point is, the whole thing is to get rid of that extra energy so they become stable. So far, so good. Now, where does some of this stuff come from? I already told you that. No, I'm not going there yet. Let's do this first. So where does it come from, this radioactive carbon-14? Well, actually, there are cosmic rays that come into the upper atmosphere. They collide with nitrogen, and they make carbon-14 out of it. So there's a certain amount in the upper atmosphere. Now, because carbon-14 is unstable, it will break back down into nitrogen. It wants to go back to nitrogen as much as an inanimate object can want something. But in chemistry, things always go towards being more stable. And carbon-14 tries to go back to nitrogen because it's more stable. And that's called the daughter product. Every 5,730 years, half of your carbon-14 sample will have gone back to nitrogen. because it's more stable. And that's called a half-life. Half of it will deteriorate back into what is stable. The other half of the radioactive will still be there. And that's a half-life, and the thing that's produced after the stable one is called a daughter product. With me so far? I know this is a lot of science. Now, living things are busy taking in carbon. We're taking it in because plants absorb it, right? In the process of photosynthesis, plants take in carbon dioxide and they make it into their tissues. And then we eat the plants and we get the carbon that way. Okay, so we're always taking in carbon as long as we're alive. And most living things take in carbon as long as they're alive. Not all, but most. And so if they know what ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 there is in the atmosphere, then they can tell how long something's been dead. Because once something dies, it's no longer taking carbon in anymore, and therefore the carbon-14 in its body will start to break back down into nitrogen. They know it takes 5,730 years, so they should be able to figure out how long something's been dead by how close that ratio is. Okay, so I already told you that. So the critical assumption that carbon-14 makes is the amount of carbon-14 to the amount of carbon-12. Because that's how, whatever it is in the atmosphere, let's say today, and then when they test something that they want to find out how old it is, they're going to compare those two ratios and see how long it would take with the known half-life of 5,730 years. And that's how they're going to determine how long something's been dead. You with me? Now, first off, I want to tell you, there are certain animals that don't take up carbon-14 at all. They have taken live mollusks and carbon-14 dated them, and they have dated it like over 1,000 years dead. They have, so that's all wrong, isn't it? See, so it's making an assumption, but that's not even the worst assumption. Let me just see what the next picture is. Okay, that's what I was telling you about. The worst assumption is this. To be able to do this successfully, you have to know how much carbon-14 there was in the atmosphere at the time the thing was really alive. If you don't know what the atmospheric ratio is to the carbon-14 at the time that it was alive, then how can you tell how long it's been dead? So they've made this assumption about how much carbon-14 there is in the Earth's atmosphere. And actually, even using their assumption, the Earth's atmosphere is less than 30,000 years old if you carbon-14 date it, because it's carbon-14 is still on the increase, and it'll come to equilibrium in 30,000 years, and it's still not at equilibrium yet. It's still increasing. But that's a carbon-14 date you never hear, isn't it? Right? And so the carbon-14 tells us how long something's been dead, but the best way they can calibrate it, because how do you find out what the carbon-14 was in the past? Does anybody here know what the oldest living thing is still alive on planet Earth today? Bristlecone pine trees. They're out west. Some of them are almost 4,000 years old. Right after the flood, they started to grow. And they won't even tell you where the oldest ones are because they're afraid people will go take pieces of them, because people do stuff like that. But what they've done scientifically is they've bored a hole in the old bristlecone pine trees that it was microscopic, so it wouldn't hurt the tree. They counted the tree rings so they could tell approximately how old the tree was, and then they tested for carbon-14 to carbon-12 in the oldest tree rings, and that gave them an idea of what the carbon-14 to carbon-12 was in the past. And guess what happens when you use the information from a living tree that's that old? All the carbon-14 dates line right up with the Bible. Wow, now that's interesting. So as soon as you take away the assumptions and start using the facts line up. Now there are other forms of radiometric dating, like I said, that we use on things that weren't alive. Like, well, they find that in coal, I just say this, after 50,000 years, there should be no carbon-14 in something. Because with a 5,730-year half-life, then after 50,000 years, they say basically it's gone. You with me so far? They have found carbon-14 in coal that is dated at 50 million years old. How can that be? Shouldn't be there. That's a problem. They have found carbon-14 in diamonds that are supposed to be hundreds of millions of years old. They don't explain it. These are things that these nasty creationists need to leave it alone type of thing. They don't explain it. And then the other forms of dating. So my point is, if you actually calibrate the dating to reality, it lines up with the Bible. The other forms of dating, like potassium-argon dating, uranium-lead dating, Mount St. Helens erupted in 1986. It was the secondary eruption, or third. In other words, it started in 1980. But there was an eruption in 1986, and it left a lava dome at the top of Mount St. Helens, which is something that you can use radiometric dating for to date. When they dated it and they knew that it was only a couple years old, the dating method told them it was either 500,000 to almost 3 million years old, and yet they knew it was only a couple years old. Now, if your clock worked like that at home, you'd be in big trouble, wouldn't you? And so we need to understand that even though it's a very technical means by which they find these dates, they still have assumptions in them. I'm not even going to try to say the name of this volcano, but it erupted in 1949, 54, and 75. Everybody saw it erupt, and yet when they dated those igneous rocks, they found that the lowest date was 250,000 years old, and they know it was less than 50 years ago that it erupted. So my point is that radiometric dating doesn't need to intimidate you because they are based upon assumptions, and if those assumptions are wrong, then everything else is going to be wrong also. So, and do you know how they pick which date they're going to use?
By what they're
Index fossils. They use the index fossils. When they get these ranges, the way they pick is by what index fossil is found in that layer. Check me on this, it's true. And so when you know how the whole thing works together, it's like, helium is well, you guys all know helium. It's the one that's in the balloons that when you go to the store and you say, I like Donald Duck, after you put it in your mouth, you guys know what I'm talking about, right? Helium is actually a radiometric, you guys know what I'm talking about, the helium balloons in the grocery store?
Oh, we know.
Okay, just making sure. When uranium breaks down, because it's very unstable, and it breaks down to lead, part of what it gives off is helium. And so the rocks around the world are giving off, as the uranium breaks down, they're giving off atmospheric helium. The trick is this. They know what rate the helium is being added. They know what rate it's escaping, and there's not nearly enough helium for the Earth to be as old as they tell us it is. So then they went down and they looked into the rocks themselves, and the helium can escape the rocks, and yet where the uranium is, they find way too much helium in the rocks, which what all that means is if you're radiometric dating the planet by the helium, the planet's got to be less than like 100,000 years old. Okay, so once again, another form of radiometric dating. Let's leave radiometric dating, let's look at another way we can date the solar system or the galaxy. This is called the winding up dilemma. This is a bar galaxy. It's the beginning of a spiral galaxy. And as a galaxy turns, it actually makes a pair of arms. With each turn, it makes a pair of arms. Well, the reason this is a dilemma for the evolutionists is because it makes one full turn, even by their reckoning, it makes one full turn every 100 million years. But our Earth is supposed to be 4,500 million years old, and the galaxy is supposed to be about 10 billion years old, not even a 1 billion. And they're supposed to make a whole turn every 100 million years. The point is this, they can't find any galaxies that are even 1 million years old. Excuse me, 1 billion years old. They can't find any galaxies that are even 1 billion years old because they would not have these distinct arms. This thing has made 3 full turns. If you look, you can see 1, 2, 3 pairs of arms. That means this galaxy is less than 500 million years old. They should be able to find lots of older galaxies if everything's as old as they tell us it is. But they can't. So that's why it's called the winding up dilemma. It's a dilemma for the evolutionists because they can't explain why they can't find the older galaxies. Oh, you can have a lot of fun with astrophysics. Oh, comets are big dirty snowballs. Every time they go by the sun, a piece of them burns off, so they don't last that long. Basically what it gets down to is there shouldn't be any more comets in our solar system if the solar system is as old as they tell us it is, and yet we have millions of circulating comets. Well, the rescue device for that, they couldn't let that one slide because that was like, So a guy by the name of Dr. Jan Oort came up with the Oort cloud. The Oort cloud is supposed to be a cloud of cometary material that is outside of the solar system. And no kidding, I heard this on the Discovery Channel. Every time a star wanders by one of these clouds, it gravitationally shoots comets into our solar system. There is no scientific evidence that exists actually for the Oort cloud. Its only evidence is that there's comets in the solar system, and everybody knows the solar system can't be as young as the creationists say it is. So there's got to be an explanation for the comets being here. Now, another guy by the name of Kuiper, Dr. Kuiper, came up with the Kuiper Belt, and it exists within the solar system, but it's way out there. And the trick is we found the Kuiper Belt. It exists, but it's not cometary material. They're big asteroids. They're almost like Pluto-sized asteroids. And so, yeah, Pluto's actually probably a Kuiperoid, and it's been taken off of the planets, and I think it's a Kuiperoid, and it's actually in the Kuiper
I
Belt.
was watching How the Universe Works on the Science Channel, and they were saying that was one of the first ones, that's why we knew that that was there.
Yep, absolutely. But see, that's not commentary material at all.
Yeah.
So it does not help their comet problem. So the comets are good evidence that things aren't that long. And I'm just going to finish this section with one that most people will end up asking eventually. If this crazy lady's true, and the Earth is actually less than 6,000 years old, how do you explain how distant starlight could get here from hundreds of millions of light years away? And we know that the universe really is huge. So how can we explain how the light could get here in just 6,000 years? And that's a really good question. And I'm not telling you either of these are the correct answer. I'm going to give you two possibilities, okay? And these are not mine. These are much smarter people than me. As a matter of fact, I had to memorize the one because it took me years to even understand it. But you guys are smart, though. You'll get this. The first one's easy. It's got to do with time zones. If we start, let's say, in New York, and we fly towards Colorado, and let's say we get on the plane at 4 o'clock, we can get on the plane at 4 o'clock, we can fly for 3 hours, and we can get off the plane at 4 o'clock, can't we? Yeah, it's got to do with time zones, right? And God actually describes the stars from Earth Standard Time because it wouldn't do us any good, especially to ancient peoples, if he described it in some other way. So he described it in Earth Standard Time. So we have to see it from Earth's perspective, even though it's not on Earth, it's someplace else. We also are making an assumption that light speed never changes, and a lot of people feel very strongly that light speed can't change or the whole of their universe would collapse. So we're going to say that light speed is fairly constant. We're just going to leave that in place so we don't freak people out. But the point is this: if you are moving west, even though you're spending time on the plane, you're actually at the same time on planet Earth. Well, basically what Dr. Jason Lyle tells us is that he's an astrophysicist, a PhD in astrophysics. He says the same is true, that as the light was heading here, it could have all happened on the fourth day, and it could have still gotten here on the fourth day because of time zones in space. And so that's one possibility. The other one is a little harder, but you can do this. I know you can. My problem with this is, in my mind, time is fixed. Okay? To me, I know how long an hour is, you know, and that's my brain. But if Einstein's theory of relativity is true, time is not fixed. Time can be altered. And the closer you get to the center of gravity, the slower time goes. And the farther you get from the center of gravity, the faster time goes. You with me so far? And so this is a gravity well, which is because when a mass is placed on space, space is a fabric, if Einstein is correct. The fabric dips in, that's a gravity well. The lower you are in the gravity well, time is dilated. It's called gravitational time dilation, so it's slowed down. And the more up on the edge, the faster time goes. Let me give you a little evidence from planet Earth. There are 2 atomic clocks on planet Earth. One is at Boulder, Colorado, so it's a mile high, and one is at Greenwich, England, so it's at sea level. These 2 clocks are based upon the breakdown of cesium, which is a radioactive breakdown. It's very, very specific. Every year, the clock that's a mile higher is something like 6 microseconds faster than the clock at sea level. Every year, the exact same amount. That, for many, is supporting evidence that gravitational time dilation actually does occur. Now let's apply that to the starlight and time issue. The Bible says over 17 times that God stretched out the heavens. If God stretched out the heavens in the past, they were closer together. And if you put all that stuff closer together, you have a huge gravity well in space. Huge. And if Earth is somewhere near the center, which as creationists we believe it is because we're told in Genesis that the stars were for signs and for seasons and for days and for years, okay? So if we're somewhere near the center and these galaxies are on the outside edge, what looks like a day to us could be millions of years to those galaxies. That's called gravitational time dilation. And that took me a long time to get my head around because the whole idea of time being flexible. And I'm not flexible when it comes to time, so I have a little problem with that. But anyway, so I've given you 2 possibilities. Do I know that one of those is true? No. But do I know that God's word is true? Yes. That's really what it gets down to. And please be aware, once again, I'm not trying to convince you. Each one of us is responsible for what we choose to believe. What I'm trying to do is expose you to information that many people find very freeing, because all of a sudden, even if they don't really understand a word I said, they go, wow, that means I can trust my Bible. And that's really why I'm standing here. I'm standing here because I want you to be able to fully trust God's word. That's what's so important to me. The last session is the most fun. We're going to do ancient man and we're going to do dinosaurs. And we'll finish with a bang. What do you say?